Well, thank you so much, and thanks for having me. I want to thank the Center and the Institute for both co-hosting this event. And I will take what's happening to today and put it in hopefully a wider context. Because we live in a time where the sheer speed with which news breaks and situations change makes sometimes for us what happened in 2011 or 2013 seem almost obsolete. And the other consequence of the sheer speed with which change has been happening in the past couple of years is it makes us forget to actually take a wider view of what's been happening. 162 years ago, Alexis de Tocqueville wrote, speaking about the French Revolution, he says, "Revolutions are not always brought about by a gradual decline from bad to worse. Nations that have endured patiently and almost unconsciously the most overwhelming oppression often burst into rebellion against the yoke the moment it begins to grow lighter." And that's what I want to talk about, this bigger trend happening in the world today. He says the regime which is destroyed by a revolution is almost always an improvement on its immediate predecessor, and experience teaches that the most critical moment for bad governments is the one which witnesses their first steps towards reform. Now, the question is, what happened in the revolutionary moment of 2011? What happened in 2013? And is Egypt better off today than it was back then? And so 8 years after the January 25th uprising, we're still asking ourselves, where is the reform? And I'm going to talk about this in three different arenas: politically, socially, and then finally economically, and highlight the critical moment of the protests of the past couple of months, and this moment of the rise of an intern, who's seen as an insider figure or a whistleblower, Muhammad Ali. And so we know that the events leading up to January 25th were pretty groundbreaking. We usually focus on January, but we forget what happened in December, right before that January, which was the parliamentary election, a parliamentary election that was marred by extreme corruption and non-transparency. And actually, it was the most rigged election in Egyptian history. So we saw that in December of 2011, when not a single member of an independent party wins, it's kind of a signaling of what was about to come, that here, working on lack of political pluralism and openness and extreme corruption, you saw people take to the streets for a myriad of issues, really about bread, democracy, transparency. And so in that, what brings us from that moment to the moment of today? Well, let's look at social society or civil society, where it finds itself. Today, there are upwards of 60,000 political prisoners. We actually don't have accurate numbers because there is no internal or external monitoring mechanism, but we know the numbers hover between 60 and 70,000. The regime has had to build between 16 and 23 new prisons to simply handle the sheer volume of people that it imprisons. What was once described by Amnesty International as Generation Protest is now regarded as Generation Jail, because much of the people who began the revolution protested in 2013, and today are the primary voices of dissent, all find themselves in prison. There have been, for example, around 1,000 cases per year of reported torture. And again, that is what is reported in independent investigation. Now, there's a critical thing to know about what is regarded as statistics in terms of torture or independent investigation. Most reports, most third-party agencies like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch can't report single incidences. So if someone says, "I was beaten in prison," unless it's double or triple verified, often these statistics can't be verified. So the numbers that we do have really might not be capturing the actual numbers on the ground, simply because of the way with which numbers have to be vetted. In terms of freedoms, police have been systematically rounding up individuals, torturing them. Prisons have been referred to, especially the women's prison, as cycles of hell because of the violence against women, the rape of female prisoners. But really, according to Amnesty International, the abuse of women or the arrest of women, mothers, sisters of activists and authors and those who are seen as against the regime is a way to kind of socially control activity today in Egypt, and has been for the past couple of years. 1,250 people have disappeared in recent years in basements of jails throughout Egypt. Disappeared meaning there is no record of where they are. At least 240 political activists were arrested between April and September of this year on charges related to insulting the president or participating in unauthorized protest. We have seen, of course, mass unfair trials, mass death sentences or sweeping death sentences, the closure of NGOs and civil society organizations, shutting down NGOs that offer support to survivors of torture or violence, especially women's NGOs, the criminal investigation of case 173 against civil rights defenders who are accused of harming Egyptian national security, the freezing of assets of all NGOs who participate in such kind of monitoring activity, the attack on press freedoms. We usually highlight the fact that there are between 18 and 20 foreign journalists, but what we also don't highlight is the blockage of websites. For example, 434 news websites are blocked in Egypt today, including Mada Masr. Mada Masr, who we know their offices were raided late last month, and some of their journalists were actually arrested and rounded up for their reporting, not just on what the conditions that prisoners are held in, but also the social and economic conditions that plague Egypt. And most recently, the investigative report on the president's son and his political and economic activities in Egypt. Last year, the Minister of Justice referred two judges to disciplinary hearings for participating in a workshop by an Egyptian group that called for drafting a law against torture of prisoners. There is no real adjudication of the law. In terms of the press, President Sisi continues to renew the emergency laws that give unchecked power to security forces and the security apparatus and allows them to detain prisoners indefinitely in a cycle of renewed detention without charges ever being brought against them. The government imposes media censorship and enforces forced evictions on any organizations that attempt to release news in Egypt. But if we think about what this really means for people, we tend to focus on the political situation. We tend to focus on the social situation. Politically speaking, the Egyptian parliament today is devoid of political parties. Much of the parliament, we know, is seen as a rubber stamp to the authority of the president, as well as the judiciary. The judiciary, which used to be celebrated as the one independent body in Egypt, is now a rubber stamp, again, to what's becoming an supreme executive authority growing in Egypt. In terms of the economic situation was part of the cornerstone of the Egyptian revolution, really calling for bread. And when we think about what this means, it's no longer about that revolutionary force of thinking about bread, because today, in 2011, we used to talk about 20 to 30% of the population living on less than $2 a day. Today, and in 2013, we had 20% of the population. So there's a little bit of improvement between 2011 and 2013. Today, in 2019, according to CapMass, which is Egypt's own economic indicator that it releases, 33% of the population lives under poverty. According to the World Bank, it's not 33%. It's actually 60% of the population which is poor or hovering on the poverty line. 60% of the population. And we used to talk about 20% of the population. And so between 2011 and 2019, we are seeing that the population is suffering much more economically. In 2011, we talked about this revolutionary moment as an endogenous shock. There were structures happening within Egypt that were fundamentally changing. But what we're seeing today is a fundamental economic, possible exogenous shock. Because if an economic crisis does hit the world, I want you to understand what Egypt looks like, and that it could be on the brink of not being able to sustain an external economic exogenous shock. For example, in 2013, not 2011, 2013, the internal debt of Egypt was 1.3 billion pounds. Today, I'm sorry, 1.3 trillion pounds. Today it is 4.3 trillion. So it has more than tripled since 2013. That's the internal debt of the country, which is doing nothing more than paying down the deficit, the interest on the deficit. And so what we're seeing is that the debt of the country is increasing, but it's not in investment in the country. When we think about the external loans, in 2013, Egypt had 46 billion in external loans. Today, it is 106 billion, which means it's doubled in the past 6 years. Add to that the growth of the people living under poverty. Today, every now and then we see Bloomberg News celebrating Egypt's 5.6 GDP growth. But this number is actually pretty misleading because the number is actually not growth for the entire country. It's growth that actually is among a certain segment of the population. It doesn't trickle down to the rest of the economy. Now think about what this means, because much of the state-owned companies are the ones that are benefiting. For example, those that built the Suez Canal expansion. The Suez Canal expansion was supposed to bring in a lot of revenue into the country. When the Suez Canal expansion, right before it was built, the revenue was 5.5 billion. Today it is 5.3 billion. And so what this means is that the impressive amount of loans that were taken to build that project that was celebrated nationally when it was opened. And I remember being interviewed about it and saying that the 8 billion in revenue that the president promises that'll increase to 13 billion very quickly is not going to happen. And I was accused back then of not being able to see the positiveness in this moment. And it was one of those, just because you build it doesn't necessarily mean the world needs it or that they will come. And they didn't. And so what was taken out as loans from the Egyptian population did not result or yield in the benefits that were promised. When we think about the fact that a lot of international organizations say that Egypt is welcome for investment and is a growth for investment. That's because today there's a 17% interest rate. And so if you invest in Egypt, it might be very beneficial in the short term, but it's not going to be beneficial in the long term. And those that will suffer the most of it are going to be the Egyptians, the Egyptian population. There is no real new infrastructure going up in Egypt. The projects, like the new cities, have not reaped the benefits that were promised. These new cities were not really thought out and planned out. For example, in this new capital that's being built, it's supposed to be built in 3 phases, while they are still in a phase 1. Phase 2 and phase 3 have not even been drawn out or written out. And so the promises that are being sold to the Egyptian population are becoming more and more apparent that they were pretty much a farce. Now, what happens when people find themselves oppressed socially and politically, but now oppressed economically? It looks like this model is no longer going to be sustainable, because while political and social repression might seemingly affect a certain segment of the population, the activists, the Islamists, today the economic situation affects everyone. And with the increasing rise of protests, you're starting to see that almost every family has a member or knows someone who's in prison. So the social, political, and now economic context is really affecting everyone in ways that they didn't affect them before. And the reason why this is all important, it brings us to this moment of Muhammad Ali and the protests of the past couple of months. So Muhammad Ali is seen as a government insider, someone who blew the whistle on what was happening, who came out and said, let me tell you what's been happening internally, that there's a lot of government corruption. And it's not that Egyptians did not know that there was government corruption. It's that the president had been regularly promising them that if with all of the austerity measures on food supplies, on oil, on cigarettes, on almost everything that the average poor person needs to survive, they says, if we all just struggle a little, Egypt will be in a better place. And what Muhammad Ali demonstrated is that it's not just corruption, but that the president was living and spending lavishly on presidential palaces. And here's that critical, I think, turning point where the population had been sold a narrative, and they're starting to see that the person selling them the narrative is actually working against this very same narrative that they sold to them. And so we saw people go into the streets and into squares protesting. And the difference in this moment is that while the fear barrier was broken in 2011, the fear barrier and the social cost to those protesters was very high, but yet they went anyway. And so it forces us to take a wider lens of, when the social cost of protest is so high, why are people going into the streets? Why are people continuing? It might be that we're in a bigger moment. And so if we take a wider view, look at what's happening in Hong Kong today. Look at what's happening in Iran, in Algeria, in Chile. In Hong Kong, people are protesting, actually real government reforms. It's becoming a pro-democracy movement. In the Netherlands, we're seeing that Dutch farmers are clogging roadways because of measures that are not in their best interest economically, socially from the regime. And this is the Netherlands. In France, we saw protesters by the Yellow Jackets. The Peruvians have come into the streets because of what's happening in their copper mining industry. In Haiti, they're calling for the resignation of their president. Lebanese citizens have been coming into the streets for the past couple of weeks because of government corruption. In Iraq, we have seen some of the most violent attacks on Iraqi protesters because they're successfully called for resignation of their president. We even see protests in Israel against the treatment of Israeli Palestinians. In the United States, we saw auto workers coming to the streets because of what's happening in the American auto industry and the lack of protections of auto workers. In Chile, we saw Chileans come out because of stagnant wages. In Iran, you're seeing protesters, and some of the most violent protests, over 200 people killed in the past couple of weeks. It started with gasoline prices, and it's kind of fledged into the social economic situation in Egypt and in Iran. In Algeria, people have been protesting since February, protesting structural and government changes. And so if you look at the trend in the world today, the economic decline of much of the world could be leading into a moment where, if these countries are not ready for this exogenous shock that most economists are saying is coming in the next 12 months, then they could be putting themselves in a situation where their countries become possibly ungovernable. Egypt has been declining socially, politically, and economically since 2013. And when you have much of the population on the brink, any gentle exogenous shock is going to be that shocking. And what Muhammad Ali has demonstrated is that the lack of trust of this new regime is growing amongst the Egyptian population. And that's why we're seeing increasing crackdown. And so if we look at 2011 versus what's happening 2019 and possibly 2020, it's not just calling for, good governance, democracy, social reform, and bread. That this really could be Egyptians coming out into the streets and calling for the survival of themselves and their country. Thank you.